rights organizations became increasingly concerned and soon made very highly critical public comments about them. Now, it was always going to be difficult to investigate and prosecute killings and massacres that took place 40 years earlier. But rather than seeking to do it in a professional and neutral manner with the help of international expertise in both investigation and prosecution, even possibly in the judging of them, the Awami League government decided to do so in a very unfair manner in order to ensure the inevitable convictions, which is what they wanted and knew they were going to get. Now, it looks like the same International Crimes Tribunal is going to investigate and prosecute the killings that took place after 16th of July, 2024. And whilst we are some way from those proceedings starting, I am concerned that Bangladesh will soon find itself, if it is not careful, in a similar situation as it was in 2013 and onwards, criticized by international human rights organizations and the wider international community. And of course, not just by the international community, but those people in Bangladesh, who I hope is a very wide community, who want to turn the tide on politicized and corrupted justice based on poor investigations and biased judges. This is, of course, what in part the popular uprising was all about. Now, I should say there are some key differences between prosecuting 1971 crimes and post-July 16, 224 killings, the most important being that the 2024 crimes have just happened and there is significant first-hand and video evidence available. And so if evidence collection is potentially much more straightforward. However, nonetheless, there are still reasons to be concerned. First, the law, the domestic law, the 1973 International Crimes Tribunal Act, needs substantial amendment to make the trials fair and anywhere near towards meeting international standards. The offence of crimes against humanity, which would be the crime which people the accused would be most likely to be prosecuted for, in the current Bangladesh law is a far broader in its definition than the recognized definition in international law. And the rule for admissible evidence in the current law is extremely broad, allowing any kind of evidence to be admitted. In addition, the law does not allow any appeal against judges' decision prior to the trial judgment itself. Now, while some of these, and there are many other concerns as well, may be able to be resolved, there are also constitutional amendments that may restrict what reform is possible. And I've heard very little discussion about these so far. Secondly, the decision to appoint former Jamaat defense lawyer as the chief prosecutor of the ICT is another concern. He was the key prosecutor who made his name as a senior member of the Jamaat-e-Islam defense team, which represent Jamaat-e-Islam leaders who were convicted and sentenced to death in extraordinarily unfair trials at the tribunal itself, now likely to be involved in prosecuting those politicians who set up the trials in the first place. Now, can such a person be an independent prosecutor? I wonder. His appointment feels more like part of a revenge fantasy, to be honest, than the decision by a government seeking to hold fair trials. There are independent, highly competent, non-political, fair-minded lawyers who could have taken up that position. So why did the government not appoint one of them? Thirdly, look at all the way partisan actors at the moment are encouraging families whose relatives were killed in post-July the 16th to file criminal cases against Awami Leaguers, politicians, for murder, even when there is clearly no real evidence against them. This does not bode well for an environment where due process can take place. I just want to end these brief initial comments by making this point. There are two members of the government, Mohammed Yunus himself and Adil Rahman Khan, who have experienced and suffered firsthand from the extraordinary politicization and bias of the criminal justice system under the Awami League government. It behoves them, for the government, to move away from repeating the same pattern of bias and politicization which they themselves experienced. It's not something that would just happen. It will take a lot of work which I don't see happening now. And if it doesn't happen, I foresee the international community coming down hard on the interim government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I think that's a sobering realization of the challenges ahead, particularly on the theme of justice with reconciliation that was spoken about in the last panel. So on that note, I'm going to call on John to address some of these questions, drawing on his experience vis-a-vis foreign policy.
Great, thank you very much. And my fellow panelists and I are very excited to have that coveted pre-lunch spot in the agenda. I started by thinking I would provide a practitioner's perspective, but in the spirit of the Monsoon Revolution, I'm going to term myself a liberated practitioner. I'm liberated from the strictures of having to represent the United States government. So after 30 plus years as a diplomat, it's a great opportunity for me to actually say what I really believe. First, I want to talk a little bit about Bangladesh's relationship with its neighbors and its role in the broader Indo-Pacific region. I won't say too much about this because other speakers who know far more than I do will talk directly to these issues, but clearly India and Bangladesh need to have a fresh start. This is going to be a challenge for the interim government given the emotions surrounding India's role before August 5th. But I was encouraged this morning listening to Professor Yunus give an interview with Deutsche Welle that he took a very pragmatic approach to this. So I think that was a positive sign. As a counter to that, though, the amount of misinformation and disinformation that's out there that is poisoning India-Bangladesh relations right now is certainly not helpful. Some of you may have noticed that one of the first meetings that Professor Yunus had as chief advisor was with the Malaysian ambassador, and he put forward a desire for Bangladesh to join ASEAN. It's unlikely that this invitation is going to be issued. However, I think this statement and this meeting itself presage a desire for Bangladesh to look east and to focus more on Southeast Asia, perhaps as a counter to what had been the trends in the last 15 years. In this regard, I think the Rohingya issue in particular is an opportunity for this government to draw a distinction with its predecessor. And again, I was encouraged by Professor Yunus's remarks on this topic in today's interview. The previous government used the refugee issue for leverage with the international community while treating the Rohingya themselves as the fifth column. So this is an opportunity for this new government to chart a new course. As far as the US and the Quad are concerned, I think there needs to be more nuance in how they approach Bangladesh as part of a broader Indo-Pacific strategy. Bangladesh, despite what you may see online, is not primarily a military asset for the Quad. No, the United States is not going to build a naval or an air base on St. Martin's Island. Rather, the value, I think, of Bangladesh in the broader Indo-Pacific strategy is to show that democracy can work and that it is a counter to the Chinese authoritarian model. Turning to US-Bangladesh relations, I think the United States is fairly well positioned in Bangladesh, despite the shift in policy in late 2023 to go easy on the Hasina regime in the immediate pre- and post-election period. So Peter Haas, wherever you are, your good work, I think, will carry on long after your tenure in Bangladesh ended. The visit that's coming up to Bangladesh by a U.S. delegation and the chief advisor's engagements at the UN General Assembly are going to provide an indication of Washington's degree of investment in supporting the interim government. After that, much will obviously depend on what happens with the U.S. election in November. A Harris administration would likely provide for continuity, while a Trump administration would certainly shift the calculus to an America First approach. I'd argue that this is more of a framing issue than a substantive one, but that's a broader discussion. I think going forward, the U.S. Congress can play a significant role, driven by diaspora constituent engagement and Yunus's personal connections. We can also, though, expect lobbyists to be very active on behalf of well-funded Hasina loyalists. There's, I think, a very real risk of Bangladesh becoming a partisan issue in the United States between pro-democracy Democrats and pro-Hasina narrative Republicans. And again, we've seen some of this play out, and I think ultimately it's unhelpful. There's an urgent need to get new ambassadors in Washington and Dhaka representing the two countries. Fortunately, from the U.S. side, our nominee for new ambassador in Dhaka is perfect for the job. David Mealy has served before in Dhaka, has served in some tough places, and will be a very able and worthy successor to Peter Haas. The job of Bangladesh ambassador in the U.S. is very complicated. It's complicated by the diaspora polarization and certainly the presence of Sheikh Hasina's son in Washington. One potential area of cooperation is in recovering stolen assets and prosecuting financial crimes. There was some cooperation on this in the 2007-2008 period with mixed success. Looking to the past, what can we learn based on the interim government's conduct of foreign affairs based on past caretaker governments? I think, first of all, we should all acknowledge that foreign policy is not and probably shouldn't be the priority for the interim government, given all that needs to be done at home. That said, I think there are some opportunities for what we call incremental dividends in the foreign policy arena, and we'll hear a speaker later talk about one very specific area in which this could potentially bear fruit. We're fortunate that Foreign Affairs Advisor Tawhid Hussain is a very experienced diplomat. He certainly is much lower profile than Iftikhar Chowdhury was during the 2007-8 period, but I don't think that's a bad thing. Professor Yunus is likely to play a much bigger role in foreign affairs than Fakhruddin Ahmed did in 2007-2008 period. In the foreign affairs arena, Professor Yunus is clearly the government's biggest asset. Appointments in Professor Yunus's inner circle are interesting, including, as mentioned before, Lutfi Siddiqui, who presumably will focus on economic statecraft. I believe the international community can play a supportive role in a number of areas, particularly when it comes time for elections and providing technical support. That said, I would caution the international community against putting a disproportionate focus on elections, which I think was the case in the past. For the government of Bangladesh, I think there needs to be an aggressive public diplomacy effort to counter the disinformation. Bangladesh should open its doors, encouraging journalists, academics, and citizen exchanges. Finally, in terms of civil-military relations, which has been alluded to, part of the reason why the United States and others pressed the 2007-2008 caretaker government to hold elections so quickly was the discomfort with a military-backed regime. A clearly civilian government probably has more room for maneuver internationally. At the same time, for its part, the Bangladesh army needs to focus internally. It needs to undo the damage done to that institution and its reputation during the Hasina period. And this is certainly important for the Bangladesh Army's continued pride of place in peacekeeping operations. That's not to say the Army doesn't have a voice, but it needs to see its role as an advisor to the civilian government and not the other way around. Finally, as was alluded to earlier, and we may talk about some more, there are some tough issues related to accountability for those uniformed members guilty of crimes over the past 15 years, and particularly during July and August, and institutional reform, including what happens going forward with the Rapid Action Battalion and DGFI. So I'll end it there.
Thank you, John. I think that's a nice broad stage of all the issues on the international stage, and I'm going to sort of narrow it down a little to something that's of great interest, which is India's relationship with Bangladesh, and call on Sushant to talk a little bit.
Thank you, Neela, and good afternoon, everyone. In particular, thanks to Mushfiq for inviting me to be a part of the panel. Let me make it clear up front that I do not speak for the Indian government or the Indian state, having no relationship with them. And with a population of 1.5 billion, I can't claim to be speaking for the Indian people either. So these are my private, absolutely my own personal and private views. That having said, let me begin by congratulating the people of Bangladesh for asserting their democratic right to be masters of their own destiny. It is no mean achievement and a formidable job that has been done. But what's done is done. The euphoria will subside soon, as we have heard from on earlier panels today. It is on the way ahead on which the real challenges lie. There are many naysayers and doomsday predictors who assert that this will all eventually end in a disaster, especially if you follow the Indian mainstream media. They have to be proven wrong. I'm confident that the conferences, workshops, task forces like these can initiate and inform conversations that can help all stakeholders engage with the situation with utmost honesty and its entirety and complexity. To begin with, to my mind, there are 3 or 4 considerations of the Indian state when it comes to Bangladesh. The first among them is what they call is the political and social instability from Bangladesh should not spill over into India, particularly into the northeastern part of India, where New Delhi's control over the region is rather fragile and hostile at the same time. So this includes the question of refugees coming into India, which can exacerbate tensions among certain states of northern India and certain communities in northeastern India. Linked to that is the second requirement of the Indian security czars, which we constantly hear that insurgent and militant groups which operate in northeastern parts of India get safe havens and bases across the border in Bangladesh. It has been believed that this was the case under the BNP regime, and this could again start. That is the second concern you hear from Indian establishment. The third, which has been pretty vocal in recent years, is that there should not be a rise of radical Islamist forces inside Bangladesh, which the current Indian regime feels can provide a base to support extremism within Indian Muslims, as it was believed was allegedly done 2 decades back by Pakistan with the Indian Mujahideen and other organizations within India. Of course, this is directly linked to India's domestic politics, which has taken a majoritarian turn under Mr. Modi, where India behaves more like a de facto Hindu Rashtra or a Hindu nation. Some would even say a Hindu Zion, a reality that is often overlooked in most of the commentary about today's India. Emanating from that ideological basis of the current Indian dispensation are the calls that we have seen from Mr. Modi, his officials, ministers, some retired diplomats, and what we in India call Godi media or lapdog media about the genocide of Hindus in Bangladesh. More than the protection of Hindus inside Bangladesh. And this is not to say that people have not been targeted or some people have not suffered, as was said in the first panel, that people have suffered, but maybe for different reasons than what it is being projected. More than about the protection of Hindus inside Bangladesh, it is about animating the core domestic support base of radicalized Hindutva core of the BJP and RSS within India by invoking the slogan that Hindu khatre mein hai, that Hindus are in danger, ergo you need to support Mr. Modi to save those Hindus. So, try and understand the difference. The target may be Bangladesh, but the audience is essentially within India to its own core supporters to animate them so that they fall behind him. And it is a very emotive issue in any case. But beyond that, beyond the partisan majoritarian nationalist perspective, there are genuine concerns about the rise of China's influence in South Asia, in India, including Bangladesh, that go beyond Mr. Modi and his party. India believes in multipolar Asia as a prerequisite for multipolar world, which means that China cannot be the sole superpower in the Asian continent, and certainly not in South Asia. Even when Sheikh Hasina was around, China had friendly ties with Bangladesh. I'm not saying that these things will dramatically shift in post-Hasina Bangladesh towards Beijing, but China's shadow looms large over India's lens on Dhaka. And this is a concern which even serious people have in New Delhi. To look at it another way, the relative decline in India's power vis-a-vis China in the neighborhood, even as New Delhi is hailed globally as a rising power, presents a very wicked problem for India. So you are locally, you are not rising because China is rising much faster than you. Globally, you are hailed. You go to Ukraine, you come to New York, you are like this great power. But within your own region, you are a relatively declining power vis-a-vis China, and this is a big problem. This is a big problem for India. India wants to therefore wield maximum influence in South Asia, and the China challenge also becomes the glue that binds New Delhi and Washington, D.C. As John just said, it allows India to influence and temper the policies of governments of the administrations in DC, as we saw late last year and early this year, which the Washington Post reported in great detail. And even though New Delhi may not always succeed, it will continue with its attempts to do so nevertheless, whether it is the question of the threat of rise of Islamic forces or the question of the China challenge. So these are the Indian apprehensions and concerns as I have understood over a period of time. Some are secular, some are nationalist, some are blatantly majoritarian. Dhaka also, of course, has its own complaints about bilateral trade, about Indian investment, about electricity pricing from Adani's power plants, political interference, water sharing and water diplomacy. I do not know what the view in Dhaka about all this is and what kind of assurances it is willing to give and what kind of demands it has of Delhi. But at this point, it seems the bilateral ties are very testy. The emotive issue of Sheikh Hasina being in Delhi or her extradition apart, trust between the two sides has completely broken down. It is therefore important to keep the lines of communication between the two capitals. So essentially what is needed, and I know I'm running out of time, in next 2 minutes, a new framework of engagement is needed between the two countries. The bottom line has to be the principle of non-interference and free expression of democratic will of the people. This demands a revival of people-to-people ties so that trust is rebuilt. We need to have more conversation between saner peoples on both sides and have joint events that are non-political and non-security in nature. They could be films, music, art, literature, whatever. You need to have more conversation between saner people. Let's have some normalcy and decency back and focus not on the most provocative statements, but on soliciting and engaging constituencies of support on both sides. This is easily said than done, I know that. But what better than this kind of platform to actually initiate that conversation and work towards that path. As far as the two governments are concerned, including the interim government in Bangladesh, a defined agenda for a structured conversation after defining the ground rules of engagement has to happen. Whether it happens in 3 years or 3 months or 3 years, it will have to be the way ahead. We can all choose our friends, but we can't choose our neighbors. For defining the ground rules and for providing the agenda for talks, I would suggest creation of a task force in Dhaka. Its recommendations have to shape the narrative in both countries in a positive manner, making people the owners of the ties between the two neighbors and not allowing the extremists on either side to hijack the agenda with emotions and rhetoric. We can either be bogged down in the weeds of the past, or we can create a better path for the future. The onus is more on the bigger country, India in this case. But the power of setting a higher moral example should not be lost to Dhaka. You can't shake hands with clenched fist, as Indira Gandhi famously said. New Delhi may be keeping its fists closed, but Dhaka has the opportunity to make the case with an open palm. This must be done on terms that protect Bangladesh's sovereignty, democracy, and national character. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask both of you this question before we turn to Shafiq and the issue of water diplomacy. So imagine Dr. Yunus is, I think he is going to be in New York next week, and you are stuck in an elevator with him. He's, one Vanderbilt, which is very close to the UNGA, 58 stories. So you don't have a lot of time to make your case. What would you say? What were the 1 or 2 things you would want to say? I'll start with John, and then we'll assume Sushant is getting on the 27th floor, so give it less time.
Great. Well, my first piece of advice would be to make the most of the visit to New York, as short as it will be, both the bilateral engagements, but also the speech to the UNGA. I mean, this is the interim government's international coming out party. Of particular significance will be Professor Yunus's likely bilateral meeting with the Indian Prime Minister. The challenge, of course, being that you need to play to both countries' domestic audiences, which, as we've heard, is going to be a challenge. Another short-term challenge and opportunity is what David talked about before, the accountability drive. This is a tricky one because others are going to react to investigations of crimes by the regime, including financial crimes that might implicate them and other foreign actors as well. Personnel is policy. So in addition to filling that job in Washington, I think the government needs to fill key diplomatic positions in London, Beijing, New Delhi, and Brussels. And I would advise that this should be a mix of both career and political officials. In New York, Bangladesh is going to be pressed on issues like Ukraine and Gaza. So the response on this needs to be thought through. Again, balancing public opinion at home and international realities abroad. Beyond that, obviously, much depends on how long the interim government remains in office. Important issues to Bangladesh like climate change should continue to be a priority, and Bangladesh has an important opportunity to speak out on human rights issues. The longer the interim government stays, the more important it will be for Bangladesh's diplomats to keep foreign friends informed about the progress of these reform efforts. There's currently a great deal of attention being paid to Bangladesh. This is a good thing, but that's going to decrease over time. Public diplomacy will be needed to counter the inevitable counter narratives. And then finally, economic and commercial diplomacy are going to be critically important to Bangladesh over the long term. There should be a shift away from the large infrastructure projects and the state-to-state deals and more engagement with the global private sector. Bangladesh's missions abroad need to engage with potential investors and business partners. And again, diaspora engagement can be key to this. Over to you.
That was a long elevator.
I pressed the pause button.
Yeah. Okay. And right after you, David, I'm going to ask you, and Shafiq, you get a separate elevator. So we're going to see.
Yeah. So, the quick response, because no time left before the ground floor is hit or whatever lobby comes. But I think two or three things. One is, temper down the rhetoric, open back channels with all capitals, including with New Delhi, and simultaneously shape the narrative in your own country by clearly articulating the principles and interests that Dhaka needs to have. I think it's very important. Otherwise, every single episode, every single death on the border, every single statement from Adani can completely derail the relationship. State your interests and principles clearly, that these are my interests, these are my principles, which we will follow. And within that broad framework, our policy will be formulated. That is the only way to shape the narrative and save the relationship and continue back channel conversations with all the stakeholders so that you clearly understand what is going on. All kinds of diplomacy cannot be public and cannot be held to the media or in the public domain. That is what I will.
Thank you. David, we'll call on you for any advice, quick advice, elevator advice recommendations for Dr. Yunus.
David, if you can hear us, you're on mute.
Okay, we'll move on. So I want to come to actually now second part, a related part really to this idea of cross-border relations and something that's been quite salient, which is water diplomacy. And Shafiq, I want to call on you to really explain some of that. There's been a lot of, disinformation has been a theme throughout, none more so than in the floods of 2024. So to really you have a nuanced view on that, to explain some of that and also some of the questions around water diplomacy.
Perfect. So let me start really. So elevator, so there is no elevator to the top floor. You have to take the stairs. So I will take the stairs. So it will be slow. So you can see the slide. So let me just not go to the slide first. Before I do that, really see, this is what I want to say really. So where you stand depends on where you sit. So right now I'm sitting here at Yale. So this is, but that's not the where I actually sit. I sit in School of Engineering and also School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. So I have a very nuanced view of engineering and diplomacy, and I'll get into this in a second. So we started with 3 questions. Is Bangladesh Boshommo free? Is Bangladesh border secure? Is Bangladesh water secure? And I'll go in that order, really. So the first one is a very broad question, and I'll start that question with a quote from Mahfouz Alam. Sadly that he could not join us. So he made a statement a few weeks ago, and I'll start it with Bangla and then I'll translate it in English. হাসিনা এবং তার ফেসিস্ট সরকারের বিরোধিতা নয়, আন্দোলনের ভাষার কারণে আমরা সবাই এক হয়েছি। In translation, it is not opposition to Hasina or her autocratic regime, but the language of the student public movement has united us. This is exactly what I heard from Aruni as well as from Prapti. So what did unite them? So this is Gen Z. I have a daughter who is also Gen Z. So what basically united them is something else. What she tells me, my daughter tells me that our collective imagination, meaning that we who are a little bit older than compared to them, imagination of governance is outdated. This is a very profound observation. Why they are saying this? The language that we're using, democracy, fascism, socialism, these are 19th, 20th century language that came from Europe and the West. It may not have any relevance to South Asia. When I talk about this proletariat versus bourgeois, in Marxist theory, we're talking about a particular class. That class is really industrial laborers. Those are not the farmers in Bangladesh. So even I borrow this idea really without thinking, why am I taking this? And hundreds of thousands of people died really for this type of movement without understanding what they're trying to do. So there is a fundamental disconnect even in the language itself. This is not 19th century. This is 2024. In 2024, Gen Z is talking about a different type of language. When my daughter says that I want equal access to resources, she is basically now viewed as a communist. This is a long labeling. What she is asking really, no, I want equal access to resources to everyone. And that is what actually this Gen Z wants. If you look at the language that Bangladeshi student uprising started, they wanted one language, that is inclusivity. I want everyone to be included. I want to be heard. Whether it can be done or not, that's a separate question. And precisely for that reason, it got the momentum that it did. So that is basically where I think we need to figure out really what it is. So when Sushant was saying that, no, we need to figure out what the principles are. I'm not interested since I am basically in academics, so we talk about theories. So I'll start with the theory and then I'll get into actual practice. What is the theory? Theory is that it has to be fundamentally based on some principled pragmatism. That's what I am. So what does those principles are? If you ask me, I'll say there are 4. autonomy, inclusivity, accountability, and justice. Bangladesh must try to rebuild itself based on these fundamental principles. See, in Bangla, this is called Nyaya. Nyaya meaning that ideal justice. Ideal justice is not Niti. Niti is what is procedural justice. We need to make a distinction. Court is a procedural justice. Nyaya is our constitution. In this country, I have the thinnest book on my shelf. It is the US Constitution. Now I have 9 Supreme Court judges, 3,000 volumes only on taxes. So those are the Niti. Niti is not Nyaya. We cannot sacrifice Nyaya. We need to be very, very clear about this. So having said that, then how does it come to really now actual problem? So actual problem, let's bring it down to the real problem that happened. In 2 weeks, Bangladesh basically faced 2 daunting challenges. August 5th, there was a serious, basically, change in the government. August 19th, we have serious flood. These are 2 major events that happens in just 2 weeks. How did Bangladesh basically work with this? I would say that brilliantly. So far, since I am perennially optimistic in terms of my principles, brilliantly done. So what did they do? So they essentially, basically, very quickly mobilized. This is for the first time. Basically, what we saw is now, can I go to the next one?
I think we slide it up there.
Okay. So when knowledge basically is not sufficient to give us certainty, or the society cannot decide what to do, then we need a synthesis of these two. That is what I'm calling this engineering diplomacy. Look at what happened with the floods in Bangladesh. In about 3 days, they raised 100 crores rupees. This has never happened in Bangladesh. They got so much resource that they said, we don't need any more. We don't need any more resources, really. We just need to go and distribute them. So that's a lesson, really, we can learn. How did basically this serious problem in 2 weeks, when there is no law and order, there is no police, still they were able to raise that much money and deal with this problem very effectively. But of course, there was a lot of misinformation, disinformation went on. If you actually look at this now, it may be very controversial that it was really a natural disaster, in the sense that 3 things happened. Basically, it was a very bad monsoon. We have nothing to do with something called Madden-Julian oscillation. That's an atmospheric system. Also, there is a low pressure depression that was sitting just over Feni in Bangladesh. It rained 312 millimeter in Feni in 1 day. In 1 day. So that is the amount of water that Feni has not seen even a year. So as a result, really, the rainfall itself could create this. On the other hand, now, if you look at really this, if you want to go further, right now, Neela, so I have another 5 minutes for continuation. Is that true or not?
Compliments.
Okay, all right. So now, if you want to look deeper into this problem, I want you to think about something really little bit more now in water. So let's go to the next one here. When we talk about water, really, we actually talk about watershed. That's what we know. The watershed is the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna watershed. China, India, Nepal, Bhutan, everybody is involved. That is the way we understand water. But that's not the main problem. The problem is that there is something I call the problem shed and a policy shed. These 3 needs to be understood. What does that mean? Problem shed for flood forecasting, now that's a problem shed, that I want to be able to forecast flood in Bangladesh. Now, if you think about Feni, Feni has no basically river coming in, so it did not have any station. Bangladesh has about 54 stations in 54 border locations. Those are the places they are essentially making forecast. Feni did not have a forecast because it was not there. So now, when the forecasts are issued from the Bangladesh Water Board, it goes to the office of the DC. So DC, so I asked my friend really here in the USA, what is DC going to do really with that information? He's not Moses, that can hold the water. So will he hold? No, he cannot do it. So as a result, and this is just in 18th and 19th, DC probably fled. So Feni DC was not there. So as a result, the communication was done very well from Bangladesh Water Board, but it did not get to go to Feni. So it broke down. Not that we did not have flood forecasting system, we did. So that's a problem shed. Now, policy shed is very different. Policy shed is now, what is the policy between India and Bangladesh for the Ganges Treaty? How much water Bangladesh should get during the dry season? I have Farakka barrage, when will it be opened? That's a policy shed problem. Unless these 3 sheds are combined in a way that they're more or less aligned, and none of these things will work. So this is where my pragmatism will come in. You have to keep the principles right, but in terms of pragmatism, unless you can align these 3, it's not going to work. So that brings us to the next one. So we have a problem. The problem is flood forecasting. Then we have a proposal. Then I have politics. Unless these three things are aligned properly, none of these things will work. So this is my very pragmatic solution that what can be done. So now what we want to do really with India, with Modi, Duk, and already Yunus made this suggestion that we should have a higher level water commission. That let's talk about flood forecasting, don't talk about politics for now. At least flood is a problem both for India and Bangladesh, and let's see whether we can do this. And we can do this only when these three streamlines are aligned. It's very important. Because if I just have that brilliant proposal, and I have one really, I know exactly what to do, but nobody listens to me. Because, and you will see it in a second. So these are the few things that actually I've written, and you can see that I was not sleeping very well. For the last 2 weeks, I've written 3 of these pieces for Daily Star. The fourth one, time to develop reliable flood forecasting model, I wrote it 4 years ago. So I basically told them what has to happen. If Bangladesh has to develop a flood forecasting model, what is it? 4 years ago, it was not there. I did not anticipate 2024, but I did write in 2020 flood, what can be done? So nobody listened. It is just sitting there. The question is basically, how do I take that knowledge now, make it actionable? So that is where we are. So with that, I'll stop there now.
I think that's great. And, we're going to come back to this, I think. And we're hearing sort of the same themes around the need about, the narrative, first of all. And I want to turn this to all the panelists really to have your say. The world landscape has changed. Disinformation is becoming such a strong part. And I think there was a question in the first panel about a coordinated, that almost needs to become part of a coordinated domestic and foreign policy response. How do you counter this? Sushant, I think you talked a little bit about the narrative being not just disinformation, but sharing of information, but also, so how do we actually develop this kind of, have you seen examples where this kind of institutional response around disinformation in the foreign policy arena has been successful?
Yeah, Neela, there are actually no great examples where any country or any government has been able to control this or to be able to rectify this once misinformation and disinformation has started. Most countries and most people end up playing whack-a-mole. You whack one, the another one comes up. The only viable option in this case is that you have your own credible media houses, which is where South Asia has suffered over the last few years, including Bangladesh. If you have your own credible media houses which run the correct news and follow a larger narrative, then the idea that the social media companies will come and completely destroy it can only be reduced. It has to be a more positive idea than a negative idea than a reaction. It has to be more proactive. It has to be more done by yourself, by your own initiative, rather than responding to what India Today is saying or what Aaj Tak is saying or what ABP News is saying. You can't do that because you will counter one, 3 more news will come up. So essentially, you have to have a more positive narrative and a more credible media as an institution within your field.
David, anything to add to that as someone who also understands the power of narrative and of information in terms of an institutionalized response to misinformation or disinformation as it relates to foreign policy relations between countries?
I just got this point that I would like to make is that under the Awami League government, the intelligence agencies funded enormous amount of disinformation. Bangladesh news websites which were really funded and controlled by the government. So I'm hoping that those no longer will exist, which I think will be helpful. But clearly, it is a huge task to deal with the misinformation that comes from other countries. I don't really know what the solution is, except as you say, the stronger the media, the more people who look towards mainstream media rather than necessarily pick up tips from social media. And that would be a good thing.
And Shafiq, I think you had made the point about sort of the internet and conflict information. Any other thoughts that you wanted to add to that?
Okay, so this is a very problematic domain, and this is not my area. So misinformation, disinformation. So I was talking to this. So my wife had a very interesting observation. She said the TV is very different than Facebook. Although both are essentially media that is propagating information, what do I choose to click on, even on the TV, that will also bias me. But there I don't have a feedback. In the Facebook, I do have a feedback because when I see something, and I also basically either make a comments or by clicking it, Facebook also knows that I like this. So next time that is what will come to me. So what I would argue really as a collective society, if we can minimize those type of impacts, at least be careful really what you're clicking. So that way really at least you can minimize the propagation of this speed of disinformation going. If you remember really during last election, suddenly in the morning we saw that Pope endorsed Trump. And it got about 700 million hits within an hour. And it is a totally false information. But it took many days really for debunk this. So before you do this, let's be careful really what is the source. Because in internet, everybody is a guru now. So everybody has an opinion. And without, even in Bangladesh, water really, I told them, look, if you just look at this Feni rainfall, that is 300 million cubic meters of water. Entire Damdor Dam, which people claim that it was broken, it only holds 700 million cubic meters of water. It was not fully cut. It's still a lot of water is there. So maybe say they release, let's say they release 100 million. It will still be much smaller than actually the rainfall that fell on Feni itself. So we need to understand really what the information is coming from. Right now from the satellite, I can see by sitting in Boston really whether there is a flood going on in Tripura or not. It's not that we have to basically go anywhere else. So those are the type of things we need to be objective really when you're making these claims, or at least being very, well, India is basically cutting all the dams. And we don't even understand the difference between a dam and a barrage. Farakka is a barrage, it's not a dam. Farakka has to be released because they cannot, otherwise basically their Bihar will get flooded.
I think it points to this idea of both individual, what we can do as individuals, but collectively, as you said, making the governments accountable for not spreading misinformation, countering that with facts, having strong media so that there is good investigative journalism with the facts. So as we sort of close this out and have questions, we have a lot of questions. I'm just going to give you each 30 seconds to really just say, we focused a lot of this conversation on what Bangladesh should do. What are the lessons that other countries in the region and around the world can learn from the events in Bangladesh? John, you go first.
I'll make it less than 30 seconds, humility.
Great.
I would say particularly for South Asia, democracy has been backsliding in all countries in South Asia, whether it is Nepal, whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it is Pakistan, India. And what has been achieved in Bangladesh by the young students should be, in some sense, institutionalized, and lessons learned from, because these are countries with the same social milieu, same economic status, same kind of culture, same kind of ethnicity. And if those lessons can be learned by other countries of South Asia, maybe democracy will improve for more than 2 billion people who live in South Asia.
All right, since this is short, so I'll follow John. So I would say that it be fallible. Fallible meaning that this is the term I use in my principal pragmatism, meaning that we will make mistakes.
Be willing to fail.
And we will fail, but we must learn from those failures. What I tell my daughters is failing once is fine. You cannot fail twice at the same mistakes. That's not acceptable. So what did you learn? And that is critically important. And we should not look for a roadmap. Roadmap assumes that I know the future. Given that future is unpredictable, I cannot do this. So what has to happen that we have to be adaptive. How do I become adaptive is very, very critical. Being adaptive and being fallible, if we keep these two principles in mind, I think we'll be in a good shape.
And David?
I think the Bangladesh scenario should make Western liberal democratic countries rethink the way they engage with autocratic allies. I think there has been a real problem in, let's take the UK, for example, in failing to be much more critical to events that were taking place in the Hasina government for many, many years, the human rights violations and the lack of democracy. Yet they seemed to support the scenario as it was then for far too long, and they were not critical enough. I think countries like England should rethink the way it supports unconditionally almost countries like Sheikh Hasina's government as it was then.
Thank you. So I think we have a lot of questions.
A couple. So I'll start with a couple from that showed up on Zoom. So I think this question is probably best addressed to John. So Bangladesh will need to work constructively with China for trade, investment, technology, and other issues. How can Bangladesh balance its relationship with the United States, India, while attracting Chinese investment and trade? From Tanvir Akram, who's an economist.
Yeah, to be honest, I think too much is made of this great game kind of approach to Bangladesh, and that somehow India, the United States, and China are all fighting over Bangladesh as this big prize. I mean, clearly Bangladesh has an important role to play, and as I argued earlier, I think Bangladesh's greatest contribution to Indo-Pacific security is as a model of how a democratic nation can move forward, meeting the aspirations of its people and playing a constructive role in the region. So if I were the US or if I were India, I wouldn't worry too much on keeping score of how we're up, how someone else is down. I would decide what my priorities are and pursue those.
Thank you. This also goes to John. You made an interesting point about career diplomats versus political appointees and how you can make a balance. But my question to you is, does it not go against the core belief of meritocracy? It was that movement, meritocracy, fairness, which actually started the entire ball rolling for Bangladesh. And in the past, whenever Bangladesh has gone for political appointments, especially in the diplomatic section, it has not worked out well.
I won't speak for what it's like in other capitals, but I can speak of what it's like in Washington if you're a Bangladeshi diplomat. You're always fighting for attention against issues that are much more salient for the United States, whether it be the executive branch or the Congress. So what's most important of all is that you're a good communicator and that you have a story to tell. And I think from today's first session, there's a tremendous story that Bangladesh has to tell right now. And as a career diplomat, I don't think career diplomats, whether they be from the United States or Bangladesh, are best positioned to tell that story. So I would, if I were Professor Yunus, I would send first and foremost a communicator to Washington who can connect with elements of the United States government and elements of the Bangladeshi community to tell the story of Bangladesh and then generate the support that's needed at home.
Okay, so I have one comment and one question. First comment is that during the student movement, Monsoon Revolution, we were heartened to see the support Bangladeshi students got from their West Bengal counterparts. There have been rallies in Calcutta. The sketch, the iconic sketch of Abu Said, that is drawn by someone in Calcutta, Kaushik. So there has been significant support, common, that we owe it to them. My question is that the problem in Indians' perception of Bangladesh, everything in the eye of Islamic Jihadism, is it really a Modi effect or is it a bipartisan event? Let me go back to 2011. Manmohan Singh, probably one of the most level-headed prime minister of India ever had. In 2011, June or something, he made a comment that 25% people of Bangladesh are Jamaat supporters, and they are getting more and more every month. And Jamaat never won more than 8-9% for the Bangladesh history. So even Manmohan Singh made the comment, and even after that, the Jamaat is overblown. India South Bloc, the Foreign Office, we have this perception they are not the right people there. They are not. They don't know Bangladesh. That's the whole point. What do you think about that?
I'm not aware. I do not recollect Dr. Manmohan Singh making such a statement, and I doubt, knowing Dr. Manmohan Singh a bit, he would ever make this a statement.
I'll
check this up. It is highly unlikely. He's very, very cautious with all kinds of statements. But that having said, if he's made it, it's a completely wrong statement to make. As far as whether this is a cross-party thing. So let's be clear, Sheikh Hasina, Awami League have cross-party support in New Delhi, have always had cross-party support in New Delhi. But what has happened in the last 10 years in India is something different. It is a very different kind of outlook and approach. As I said, the idea of Hindu nation, the idea of a Akhand Bharat or a undivided India, the idea which you saw through the Citizenship Amendment Act, the idea that you saw through Amit Shah calling Bangladeshi people termites. This is not something which was happening before 2014. So there is a substantive difference. There's a difference between people having biases and those biases being weaponized into hatred and targeting of people. There's a massive difference between the two things. Biases have always existed in societies and communities, but when those biases are weaponized to target groups or communities or people, it's a different thing. So I would say those biases, of course, existed. There were problems between India and Bangladesh. I'm not saying India was a perfect country before 2014. There were all kinds of people. But eventually, there has been something which has dramatically shifted since 2014 in India.
With Rahul Gandhi, the new generation will it change, hopefully?
Who knows? Let's see.
We'll have that discussion at the side during lunch. But
Okay,
go ahead.
I have rather a comment and question, but I would like to put it out there so that I will start where David left. Basically, what is the lesson for the West? Over the last 15 years, the democracy was left behind by the Western countries, period. I mean, the role of France, the French ambassador, and so on and so forth. Despite some noises made from Washington, US has never abandoned Hasina regime, and they worked with. If there is a lesson for the West, this is the lesson that they should learn, that how they interact with regimes like Sheikh Hasina. And this is for the other countries as well, but particularly for South Asia. Especially, I would like to draw attention of Washington's dealing with, with South Asian countries. I know, John, you might not agree with me, but looking South Asia through the prism of New Delhi doesn't work. Actually, it is costing quite dearly for the Western countries as well as for the people in the democracy, those who have the aspiration for democracy, whether it's in Nepal and Sri Lanka or Maldives. And that is what is creating the opportunity for the assertive Chinese policy. That's my first point. The second thing with respect to India's policy, despite the fact that I do agree that there has been some shift, a dramatic shift in the last 10 years with respect to the policy regarding Bangladesh from India. But the but here starts. The first thing that we remember is 2013, when Sujata Singh landed in Dhaka. It was under Congress government. They started the process of democratic backsliding, supporting a regime which has no support whatsoever, because India's business interests superseded, and its myopic policy towards its neighbor. It's not only Bangladesh. It is, if we look at the relationship between India and Maldives and Nepal, Sri Lanka, this has been, and it has been shared by the Indian, not only Indian establishment, with due respect to my friends and colleagues in India's academia and media, there's so much driven by two things. One you have mentioned is this contrived fear of Islamism. The second thing is, with respect to Bangladesh, is they carry this 1971 in their head. Bangladesh has moved out of 71, carrying the aspiration of 71. India got stuck in 71 in the event of 71, not the aspiration and the spirit of it. That is the problem. That is shared by the Indian establishment. That is shared by the Indian academia. And that drives the policy, which is basically a very myopic policy. At one point, I had this opportunity in 2013 in Washington to tell a very important, high-ranking Indian official that Sheikh Hasina, how long is she going to survive? 25 more years? But Bangladesh is going to survive for the next 1,000 years. You're just forgetting that, please. That is what I see in the policy of New Delhi. And that hurts me because, as you have mentioned, we can choose friends, we cannot choose the neighbors. But if the neighbor thinks that we are enemy, every morning it reminds and treat a country without the dignity of independence and sovereignty, it's very difficult to have a friendship at that point. Thank you.
quick response. In 2012, etc., because I distinctly remember that India was trying to meet BNP and Khaleda Zia, specifically the Indian dispensation. So I do not disagree that Indian state's policies towards its neighborhoods have been problematic to a great extent. But what I'm trying to say is that there's a significant disjuncture which comes at 2014. This is not to say that everything was hunky-dory before that, but the significant disjuncture of 2014 should not be discounted. As far as the 25% thing, while he was making the comment on the Western, I did check the comment. Dr. Manmohan Singh's off the record comment, which was deleted, was that 25% of people in Bangladesh, including Jamaat, do not like India or are opposed to India. That is what is going. It was not that Jamaat has 25% supporters, which included BNP, and it was an off-the-record comment, which was then deleted by this thing.
Do you have more questions?
Oh, yeah, there's one more question from Zoom. Is there a future for SARC? And I'll just add, of course, we've heard some talk about
So SARC has not been killed by Bangladesh or by any other country. SARC has been specifically killed by India since 2015. India has decided that it does not want to be part of a forum in which Pakistan continues to be there. It has tried to promote an organization called the BIMSTEC, which actually excludes Pakistan and Afghanistan, but includes Thailand, other than all the other countries of the region. It is the Bay of Bengal. So, it's a quite a convoluted acronym that is there. And BIMSTEC by itself has failed because Myanmar, Thailand, each of these countries are in their own kind of turmoil. Sri Lanka, Nepal, they're all in their own kinds of turmoil. And the BIMSTEC summit, which was supposed to be held by Thailand earlier this month, in fact, 10 days back, was cancelled at the last moment because Thailand, the government had changed. The prime minister had been removed. So BIMSTEC has not worked out. But is any thought, because SARC runs on consensus, is there any thought process in India about a rethink on SARC? No. There's no rethink. And clearly, as David said, and as has been the conversation and reported, that Dhaka is now looking more towards ASEAN and would want to be a part of the ASEAN, even though it may not happen. So it's actually like Pakistan earlier moved away towards West Asia from South Asia, and India thinks itself as part of the Indo-Pacific. Bangladesh now sees itself as part of East Asia rather than being part of South Asia.
All right. So let me just make one comment about SARC and then I'll tell something else. SARC, it was an interesting idea, but I think it's dated. So to make your point, really, in South Asia, one of the most important resources is water. SARC does not talk about water at all. Water has been taken out. So you have to understand really how SARC was created. This was created like as a pseudo-organization for doing what I do not know, maybe just to go and have some trips. Because it does not have water really even as a particular resource. How could that be really when you're talking about South Asia? So having said that, I think this is something very provocative, but I'll make the case because since I'm an academic, I can do anything I want because nobody listens. Most of the UN institutions are becoming irrelevant. Why do I say that? At the beginning of pandemic, WHO has a budget of $3 billion. $3 billion, that's it they have. Bill Gates can give you $30 billion tomorrow to run food. So that means these organizations really were created after Second World War. Now they have become dated. Right now, NGOs are much more powerful than the government organizations. What is basically World Bank doing? Right now in Africa, China is much more important than World Bank is because World Bank doesn't have enough money. China is building hundreds of thousands of small dams with 30-year contract. After 30 years, who is going to take care of them? Nobody. They will go and make money and then they'll leave. China is buying a lot of land in Africa because they know that is the place really most of the things are still unexplored. Because in Africa, we have a lot of land still left. Most of the land in Bangladesh, India are already over irrigated. So what we need to think, I go back to Gen Z, our thinking about these institutions, democracy, fascism, socialism, forget about them. Honestly, forget about them because in one of my pieces, I said there are two types of democracy in the world right now. Broadly speaking, very general, democracy 1 and democracy 2. In democracy 1, most of the institutions are more or less respected. The US is 1. Bangladesh is democracy 2. I cannot assume that Bangladesh will have a democracy 1 type of functioning. We need to create something else. And unless we, based on those some principles, we're stuck. And I hope this will happen. And this is my optimism here.
Great, thank you.
So, one last question, and then Neela, you can close the session. I'll close the conference.
Yeah.
What spoke to me is the comment in Africa, there's a lot of land. I'm a Kenyan. We have use for our land. Use for our land for our agricultural purposes, use for our land for mining. And that mentality is why we currently have an Adani situation in Kenya. Adani is trying to get airport land in Kenya for 30 years. And my understanding of Adani is that he's very close to your president or your prime minister. And I would like to say this, if you've watched anything about Kenyan protests, Kenyan youth are just the same as Bangladeshi youth. We're not just taking all this lying down, and we're very unhappy when people make, it's like you're glossing over our existence. So I would say to the crowd here, Africans have use for their land. And we have agency, we have our personal interests, we have ambitions, we have hopes. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a great discussion. We should continue it. I think I like the note on which it ended with the idea of the youth. We started with this idea of the youth really starting this movement. We heard a lot about principled pragmatism, translating that into action, the tough challenge around justice and reconciliation, not making a mistake. I think this huge challenge around disinformation in a new landscape and how we counter that. I want to end with a quote which is attributed to Dr. Yunus. Now, I don't know whether he did say this or read it, but I think it sort of encapsulates this discussion. Human beings are extremely creative and resilient, especially when they're operating within an institutional framework that encourages and supports their actions. I think that's something for us to take away. There's been creativity, bravery, but we need the institutional framework now to support that going forward. So thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to the very patient audience. And we continue this discussion.
Then now I'm standing between food and all of you. So let me just take 2 minutes to thank everyone. So first and foremost, the panelists, not only on this panel, but the previous panels as well. And they put a lot of effort in. Second, people who traveled here, like all of you put extra effort in to come here. Thank you. But also the audience. I noticed that over Zoom, the modal number that I saw was over 100, right? And then on top of that, Dhaka Tribune and Channel 24 was also sharing, and hundreds of people signed up, listened to us from Bangladesh. So finally, of course, all of us, me included, will need to take some time to process all of this. Was this conversation useful? Do we need to have more of them, right? Why are we even talking about this, right? So, there was euphoria here, I know among many of you, on August 5th, but that didn't last long. We have really fundamental, deep challenges that we need to face up to, right? Some of it's external facing, but a lot of it is internal facing. And we need to, I do think we need to have these conversations. These are not easy conversations that you already saw today. It's good that we had some open conversations and some places where we disagreed, some places where we called each other out, right? And we will need to call ourselves out. That includes the media, that includes academia, that includes civil society, right? And I think that we have what I'm seeing is a tendency of categorizing things into good and evil, right? And as we all know, the world isn't like that, right? All of us are somewhat responsible for everything that has happened, right? And these conversations are going to continue happening. I think it's better if you have it in public, right? And I think it would be better if we can use our collective skill set, right? Both within Bangladesh as well as outside Bangladesh, like you pointed out, right? In order to solve problems, because we are all interested in peace and prosperity, and hopefully we'll just continue talking. Okay, so thanks very, very much for participating today. It was a long day. It's not easy to like sit through 4 hours of talks. And finally, thank you to all the organizers. So South Asian Studies Council, Macmillan Center, YRISE, all the staff that put in a lot of effort. And many of them are outside preparing your food right now. So I'll say this again to them. And Orani, do you want to say something? Or you're okay?
I don't know. I think everyone's hungry.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, thanks very much. So hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Mushfiq, for organizing this.
Oh yeah, one final thing I kept